I think of the I states, I'm going to be late April, early May is really a good sweet spot to be. There's certainly going to be conditions where the fields are a little ready a little bit earlier. I know there's been last couple of years some March. I had some March planted beans with some cooperators this year. By and large, I really don't like to go that early because odds are that you are going to get that dip in temperature. You are going to have some issues. So usually, if I'm within that April period, I can handle it. Soil temperatures, I usually want to be around that 50-degree mark and starting to rise, but we can handle a little bit cooler conditions than that corn crop can.
If that soybean has some pretty good protection on it,
Yep.
does that allows a little bit earlier planting?
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. Seed treatment has to be a part of that, right? If you're looking at doing naked soybeans in the middle of April or late April, you're just asking for a disaster. If you're asking for whether it's Pythium or if you got fields, we got some fields that run Phytotha really bad. So I think you have to have a good fungicide seed treatment on there. I'm not as much on the insecticide seed treatment, at least in the geography that I run. I don't see that as much of an issue. Every now and then you can catch some of these odd, corn seed maggots or wireworms, but by and large, get a good seed treatment on there. Fungicide for those early seedling diseases. There's a little bit of a flip of the coin how much you gain on some of the SDS type seed treatment. So I think that should be at least considered because, again, when SDS comes in, that sun death syndrome, that's during that cool vegetative period, right? The cool, wet conditions during vegetative growth is when that infection occurs. You don't see it foliarly until August and September.
But how do we know if it's SDS or how do we know if it's red crown rot?
Yep, so that's a great question. So, I mean, that's perfect, right? You can pay me the $20 later to give you that lead in. So the thing with SDS, brown stem rot and red crown rot, all three of them show leaf symptomology that's very similar. This intraveinal chlorosis, usually during seed fill, R4, R5. I call them the state fair kind of disease. So in Indiana, state fair is in August, and we need to go out there and look at them. So you've got the foliar symptoms. Now we got to go down to the roots and the stems. So like SDS, you can split the stem open, look at the interior, look at the pith, look at the cortex, again, to kind of diagnose whether you've got SDS, brown stem rot, and then red crown's going to have more of the fungal bodies, the red, brownish fungal bodies on the outside of the stem near the soil line.
Now, I grew up, and I'm assuming your dad probably taught you the same thing, that soybeans generate their own nitrogen.
Sure.
And you today told the boys here they need a little nitrogen.
Well, they need nitrogen, and where are they getting it from? What I talk about is, okay, understand your supply. You're getting nitrogen from fixation, which is that what you alluded to, right? This bradyrhizobium interact with soybeans to provide it through. All right, we grab it from the atmosphere, fix it in the nodules, and then supply it to soybeans. But they also get it from our soils, and they can also get it from plant residues, old stover, or you think about residual nitrogen from fertilizer. They'll use it in the easiest form possible. So soybeans are going to get it from the soil first. If there happens to be a nitrogen from fertilizer there, and then it's going to come through that fixation. Now, the idea of what I talked about today is, okay, how can we boost any of those, right? I don't want to spend money on just fertilizer nitrogen. I don't see that as a way to win this. Well, the way I see to win is, okay, if you got fields that have good nitrogen supply through fixation, how can we boost that? And so a lot of the work that we've been doing within this space is applying sulfur to boost the fixation.
How does sulfur boost nitrogen fixation?
Right, so sulfur is needed as a cofactor for nodulation. So you got to have sulfur when those bacteria infect the root hairs. So then there's a number of different associations. When you look at the iron, again, without going all the chemistry of this, right, you've got the iron complex that's there. It also helps in terms of having more photosynthates, more ATP come down from the plant into that bacterioid. And then within there, it also boosts more bacterioids, so more nodules and bigger nodules.
A lot of folks are going to say there's a lot of different kinds of sulfur. What sort of ones that will do what you want them to do?
Sure.
Which is the preferred way?
Well, I want sulfur in a soluble form. So whatever you can do to be soluble for that crop. So does that mean liquid? No. What that means is, okay, is there sulfur through organic matter that's being broken down, mineralized? You betcha. You don't have to do anything if you got good mineralization. But if you're planting in April, soils are cooler, mineralization tends to be a little slower. So there's a case where we've been seeing some nice gains with a soluble product, whether it's like an ammonium sulfate, a pelletized gypsum. Those fertilizers are soluble once water hits it. ATS is a liquid. You can spray that on top of the ground. It's been kind of a mixed bag for me, but it's still not a bad source.
Now, for the folks, and I didn't see many raise their hands in the audience here, we're using cover crops.
Yep.
But for those farmers maybe who are getting into cover cropping, how do they blend in those cover crops, providing any nitrogen, providing sulfur, things like that? Where do all of those cleats on the wheel
Sure.
fit together?
Yeah, so the idea of having something green during this off season, the winter season, makes a lot of sense because you're going to capture those nutrients that weren't taken up. In particular, we think about like the mobile ones. We think about nitrate in particular, that if you're coming after a corn crop and then we have the residues breaking down the fertilizer that's there, you want to take it up so it doesn't go down to the water system, doesn't go to the drainage ditch, doesn't go to the river. So cover crops in particular, I think like the grasses, like a cereal rye, does a good job of taking that up. We've seen that documented in terms of reducing the amount of nitrates in the water, right, in the soil water. Out of that, now you also have some other nutrients that are taking up phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. All right, so you take it up in the plant material, above ground, below ground. Now the real crystal ball of it all is like, how do I release it and when do I release it for that following crop? And so what we've been looking at is over the last couple of years is that I think there's an opportunity, big picture for that, but I also think that we've added carbon to the system. Again, carbon's good. We want organic matter, but in a temporary sense, we can immobilize nitrogen and sulfur, and we've been seeing some of that. So if you want a little explanation on that, I'm going ahead. I'm reading your eyes here. So within CRI, we've done a number of studies that we're terminating, 12, 14 inches tall. Not huge biomass, 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds of biomass. So there's not a lot of biomass there, but there's enough biomass, enough carbon that we're immobilizing sulfur through the plant residue and the soil. So in those situations, we're actually getting a yield decrease in our soybeans with CRI with no fertility added, to the point that over 2 years we've got about a 7 bushel yield hit. But we've overcome that. We've looked at nitrogen by itself. We've looked at sulfur by itself and the combination. To answer the question, is it immobilizing sulfur? Is it immobilizing nitrogen? And from what we've seen, it's immobilizing, taking sulfur out of play to the point that we have nitrogen deficiencies. So follow that. Take sulfur out because it's affecting nodulation and fixation. So the CRI is affecting sulfur, therefore the nitrogen supply. And we can overcome it by applying, you guessed it, fertilizer sulfur. So AMS, pelletized gypsum are two good sources.
I'm gonna think about that for a while.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can work that through a number of ways. Your bedtime, you're reading the book next to the fire, is like, what was he talking about? He does sulfur then affected the nitrogen? Yes, it does.
Biologicals,
Yep.
last question. I didn't realize there were 1,200 companies that are
Yep.
making biologicals.
Yep.
That's too many choices for
Just a few.
somebody like me. But you had indicated that there were a couple of them that you treated, and how did they pan out with all of the other things that we've talked about?
Yeah, so I wanted to look at a lot of the nutrient supply and biologicals. And so I honed in on those that are nitrogen suppliers outside of bradyrhizobium. So two products in particular were Envita by Azotic and then Nutrition N by Corteva. There's similar products that are used also in corn. There's a few other ones that are commonplace in corn. And so a lot of the question is, okay, can we supplement our nitrogen programs in corn by reducing fertilizer nitrogen and adding the biologicals? Same thought process in soybeans. So I've looked at those in situations where I know that I've had a compromise in terms of a nitrogen supply, in particular through fixation. Again, this idea that we apply sulfur in soils that are cool, so we have limited mineralization, we boost that fixation. Well, what if we go away from that and just do a biological application at V4 to overcome it? And so we've looked at that for 2 years now. We've had a blip here and there where in 2023 where we got a little bit of a gain, maybe 3 or 4 bushels with both those products, Envita and Nutricia, on their own right. But we also had it in combination with sulfur that's there to boost fixation. And then that play is still there. The sulfur was boosting fixation to the level of, I think, 13 bushels in 2023, well above that little 4 bushel response that came from here and there on those biologicals. So right now, I'm not seeing a major play for those. I also want to look at context, right? June of 2023 was very dry, so that time period gives us a strong nitrogen deficit on soybeans, and so it kind of makes sense where we probably did gain a little bit every now and then from that biological. In 2024, we did a number of locations and didn't see any response to them.